Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of New York City. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1917, as the Great War raged across Europe, New York City's upper society continued its lavish gatherings behind closed doors. The newspapers were filled with reports of overseas casualties, influenza outbreaks, and wartime rationing, but on Fifth Avenue, where the wealthiest families resided, life continued almost undisturbed. Almost. At 721 Fifth Avenue stood the Blackwood Mansion, an imposing Beaux-Arts structure of limestone and marble, 4 stories tall with 27 rooms. It was here that Eleanor Blackwood, sole heiress to the Blackwood Railroad fortune, maintained one of the most respected positions in New York society. She was 32 years old, unmarried, and in control of what many estimated to be approximately $15 million, a staggering sum for the time. Eleanor was known for her refined taste in art, her generous donations to the Metropolitan Opera, and her winter charity balls. What wasn't known about Eleanor Blackwood would remain hidden for nearly 50 years, until a renovation in 1963 revealed something that contradicted everything society believed about the dignified heiress. What construction workers found sealed behind a false wall in the mansion's East Wing basement was a collection of meticulously organized items. Ledgers containing detailed financial transactions, numerous identification papers with different names, several handcrafted wigs on wooden stands, and a collection of newspaper clippings about missing persons throughout the Northeast. The renovation foreman immediately contacted the police, but what they uncovered was quickly suppressed, only to resurface in fragments through declassified internal memos decades later. According to these documents, Eleanor Blackwood appeared to have been leading 2 completely different lives. The Blackwood family had earned their fortune through railroad expansion in the 1880s. Thomas Blackwood, Eleanor's father, was known as a ruthless businessman who acquired failing rail lines across the Northeast and Midwest. When he and his wife Caroline died within months of each other in 1910, both from what was recorded as complications of pneumonia, their only daughter Eleanor inherited everything. Eleanor had been educated at private schools in Boston and had traveled extensively through Europe before her parents' deaths. Acquaintances described her as quiet, observant, and extraordinarily composed. She rarely attended social functions before her parents' passing, but transformed afterward into a central figure of New York society. She was always impeccably dressed, noted Margaret Astor in her private correspondence from 1916, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to be evaluating everyone around her. When she looked at you, you felt as though you were being appraised rather than seen. What's peculiar about Eleanor is how little personal information exists about her before her parents' deaths. No school records were ever located at the Boston institutions where she supposedly studied. The few photographs that exist show a slim woman with dark hair always worn up, her face partially obscured by veils or shadows, as was sometimes fashionable for portrait photography of the era. The mansion staff consisted of a butler, 2 housemaids, a cook, and a gardener, all of whom lived on the property, except for one housemaid who resided elsewhere. What's unusual is that Eleanor appeared to maintain strict boundaries about which staff members could access different parts of the house. The East Wing was entirely off-limits to all staff except for Eleanor herself and, occasionally, her personal maid, Harriet Walsh. Walsh would later become a figure of significant interest in the investigation, but her eventual fate remains one of the many unanswered questions in this case. What we do know comes primarily from the household account books that survived and the testimony of James Barrow, the Blackwood gardener, from 1911 to 1919. In an oral history recorded for Columbia University in 1959, just 4 years before the renovation discoveries, Barrow recalled several unusual patterns in the household. Miss Blackwood would disappear for days at a time, he stated. The staff was instructed to maintain normal operations and told she was visiting friends in Rhode Island or Connecticut. But I maintained the grounds year-round and never once saw luggage being taken to or from a car when these supposed trips occurred. According to Barrow, Eleanor would often retire to the East Wing, and the staff was explicitly instructed never to disturb her there, even in emergencies. There was a separate entrance to that section of the house, Barrow noted. Sometimes I'd be working near the East Garden and hear that door open and close, but Miss Blackwood was supposedly away. When I mentioned this once to Mr. Fleming, the butler, he became quite agitated and told me I must have been mistaken. What makes this recollection particularly significant is that it aligns with certain irregularities found in the household ledgers. While Eleanor Blackwood was reportedly traveling, the kitchen was still preparing meals for someone in the East Wing. Coal deliveries for heating that section continued uninterrupted even when she was supposedly absent for weeks. The ledgers found behind the false wall in 1963 provided even more disturbing insights. They documented substantial cash withdrawals from various banks throughout New York and New England, all from accounts under different names, but apparently controlled by Eleanor. The amounts were precisely noted with corresponding dates and locations. Even more unsettling were the newspaper clippings. They documented the disappearances of at least 11 individuals between 1911 and 1917. All were young women between the ages of 18 and 25. All were described as having fair complexions and dark hair, and all had disappeared from locations where, according to the financial records, Eleanor had withdrawn money within days of the disappearance. The most comprehensive set of clippings related to a young woman named Catherine Miller, a shopgirl who vanished from Hartford, Connecticut in April of 1913. What makes Miller's case stand out is that her disappearance generated significant press coverage due to her father's position as a respected doctor in the community. The investigation revealed that Miller had received a letter offering her a position as a lady's companion for a wealthy widow willing to pay 3 times her shop wages. She had gone to meet this potential employer and never returned. The Hartford Courant ran daily updates on the case for nearly 2 weeks. Eleanor's ledgers show that she had been in Hartford the day before Miller disappeared, had withdrawn a substantial sum from an account under the name Elizabeth Winters, and had returned to New York the day after. No trace of Catherine Miller was ever found. What investigators did find in 1963, however, were 3 distinct handwriting samples in the hidden ledgers. One was clearly Eleanor's, matching her known correspondence. The second remained unidentified. The third, after forensic examination, was determined to be consistent with samples of Catherine Miller's handwriting from letters her family had preserved. This suggests that Catherine Miller may have been brought to the Blackwood mansion. But in what capacity? Was she held against her will? Was she somehow coerced into participating in Eleanor's double life? The ledgers continue to show entries in this third handwriting for approximately 8 months after Miller's disappearance, then abruptly stop. A particularly disturbing entry, dated December 18, 1913, appears in what is believed to be Miller's handwriting. I have become proficient in the voice. E says my Connecticut accent still emerges when I am tired. Must practice more. The exercises for changing posture are painful but effective. This suggests that Miller may have been training to impersonate someone else, or perhaps being trained to become another Eleanor. The question of what happened to these missing women remains unanswered. No human remains were found during the 1963 renovation or subsequent investigations of the property. The basement area where the documents were hidden showed no evidence of having been used to detain anyone. In fact, it appeared to have been more of a workshop or study with a desk, chair, and various tools for crafting wigs and altering clothing. What investigators did find, however, were detailed instructions for changing one's appearance, voice, and mannerisms. These notes were meticulous, describing how to modify posture to appear taller or shorter, how to alter speech patterns to suggest different educational backgrounds, and how to create the impression of different ages through subtle makeup techniques. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing possibility, that Eleanor Blackwood may not have been keeping these women captive, but rather assuming their identities for periods of time. The collection of wigs found in the hidden room, all in varying shades of brown and black, supports this theory. So do the multiple sets of identification documents discovered, each featuring a photograph of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor, but with subtle differences in appearance. What remains unexplained is why. Eleanor Blackwood was one of the wealthiest women in New York. She had social standing, influence, and freedom unusual for women of her era. What would drive her to create elaborate alternate identities? And what happened to the women who disappeared? To understand Eleanor, we must look deeper into the history of the Blackwood family and the circumstances of her parents' deaths. Thomas and Caroline Blackwood's deaths in 1910 were, as mentioned earlier, attributed to pneumonia. They died within 3 months of each other, Thomas in January, Caroline in April. The family physician, Dr. Philip Harrington, signed both death certificates. What's notable is that Dr. Harrington himself died unexpectedly in October of that same year from what was described as heart failure, though he was only 53 years old and had no known history of heart problems. With the doctor's death, any questions about the Blackwoods' illnesses died with him. But household staff later reported that Caroline Blackwood had been in excellent health until her husband's death. Her rapid decline afterward was attributed to grief, but some staff members privately expressed surprise at how quickly and severely her condition deteriorated. Margaret Shaw, who served as a housemaid for the Blackwoods from 1909 to 1911, gave a statement to police in 1963 that adds another layer to this mystery. Shaw, then in her 70s, recalled that in the weeks before his death, Thomas Blackwood had become paranoid about being poisoned. He would only eat food that was prepared specifically for him by Mrs. Blackwood, Shaw stated. He refused anything from the kitchen and became terribly thin. He accused everyone in the household of trying to kill him, even his own daughter. Mrs. Blackwood said it was just his mind failing, but he seemed lucid enough when discussing anything else. After Thomas Blackwood's death, Eleanor took on the responsibility of caring for her mother, often bringing her meals and medicine personally. Caroline Blackwood's decline was swift, and she was bedridden within weeks. The only people allowed in her room during her final days were Eleanor and Dr. Harrington. Could Eleanor Blackwood have been responsible for her parents' deaths? The evidence is entirely circumstantial, but the timing is certainly suspicious, especially given Dr. Harrington's subsequent death and Eleanor's inheritance of the entire Blackwood fortune. A review of Thomas Blackwood's business correspondence from 1909, discovered in the archived records of his primary bank, reveals another potential motive. In a letter to his attorney, Blackwood expressed concern about his daughter's mental stability and indicated he was considering having her institutionalized. "E continues to exhibit troubling behaviors," he wrote. "The incidents with the household staff are increasing in frequency, and her explanations grow less convincing. Caroline refuses to acknowledge the severity of the situation, but I fear we can no longer delay seeking professional intervention. Please arrange a private consultation with Dr. Bancroft at Westbrook Sanatorium at your earliest convenience." No record exists of this consultation ever taking place, and Thomas Blackwood died just 3 months after writing this letter. Was Eleanor aware of her father's intentions? Did this precipitate whatever happened to the Blackwood family? Whatever the truth about her parents, by 1911, Eleanor was one of the wealthiest women in New York and appeared to be establishing the elaborate dual life documented in the hidden ledgers. The earliest newspaper clippings about missing women date from September 1911, just 5 months after Caroline Blackwood's death. The first disappearance was that of Jane Porter. a 22-year-old music teacher from Albany. Porter had advertised her services in local newspapers and was last seen leaving for what she told her landlady was an appointment with a wealthy potential student. Her belongings were found packed in her room as if she had expected to return. Eleanor's ledgers show that on the day of Porter's disappearance, she had withdrawn money from an Albany bank under the name Margaret Wells. 2 weeks later, entries in the Blackwood household accounts show that Eleanor was traveling for 10 days, during which time meals were still being prepared for someone in the East Wing. This pattern would repeat with disturbing regularity over the next 6 years. A woman would disappear, usually after being offered employment of some kind. Eleanor's financial records would show activity in the same location around the same time. She would then supposedly travel for a period during which time someone was still occupying the east wing of the mansion. The staff rarely saw these supposed guests, but James Barrow recalled occasionally glimpsing a woman who resembled Eleanor, but whom he was told was a visiting cousin or friend. They looked similar enough that you might think they were related, but something was always off about these visitors. They never spoke to the staff directly, and Miss Blackwood was always very insistent that they not be disturbed. A particularly telling incident occurred in the summer of 1914, according to Barrow's testimony. I was pruning the roses near the east wing when a window opened on the second floor. A young woman looked out. I assumed it was Miss Blackwood at first, but she called down asking if I was the gardener. Her voice wasn't right. It was higher with a different rhythm to it. When I answered yes, she asked if I could bring fresh flowers for her room. I said I'd need to ask Miss Blackwood first, as we had strict instructions about the east wing. The woman's face changed then. Her expression became almost frightened, and she quickly closed the window. When I mentioned this to Miss Blackwood later that day, she told me I must have been mistaken, that there was no one staying in the east wing at present. Harriet Walsh, Eleanor's personal maid, might have been able to provide more insights, but her whereabouts after 1917 remain unknown. According to household records, Walsh was dismissed in November 1917 with a substantial severance payment. No reason was given for her termination, and no reference letter was provided, unusual for a personal maid who had served for several years. What is known about Walsh comes primarily from census records and a brief interview she gave to the New York Sun in 1916 for a feature on the lives of those who serve New York's elite. In that interview, Walsh described her employer as meticulous and particular about her privacy, but otherwise unremarkable. She mentioned that her duties included maintaining Miss Blackwood's wardrobe, assisting with correspondence, and occasionally accompanying her on shopping excursions. What Walsh didn't mention, but what the household accounts reveal, is that she was paid nearly 3 times the standard wage for a lady's maid. She also received frequent bonuses, noted in the ledgers, often coinciding with Eleanor's supposed trips away from the mansion. Was Walsh complicit in whatever Eleanor was doing? Was she being paid for her silence? Or was she simply unaware of the true nature of the activities in the East Wing? Walsh's dismissal coincides with the last documented disappearance in Eleanor's collected newspaper clippings, Grace Bennett, a 24-year-old nurse from Boston who vanished in October 1917. Unlike the other clippings, the articles about Bennett were not merely collected, but annotated in Eleanor's handwriting with cryptic notes such as unsuitable temperament and too much family inquiry. The Boston Globe coverage of Bennett's disappearance indicates that she had recently graduated from nursing school and had been offered a position caring for an elderly woman in a private home. She told her roommate that the position paid extraordinarily well and would allow her to save enough to open her own practice within a year. She departed for her new position on October 17, 1917, and was never seen again. Eleanor's ledgers show that she was in Boston on October 16th and 17, staying at the Parker House Hotel under the name Victoria Caldwell. She returned to New York on October 18th, and on October 19th, Harriet Walsh was instructed to prepare the blue guest room in the East Wing for an arrival. On November 3rd, just over 2 weeks later, Walsh was dismissed from service. By November 10th, according to the household accounts, the guest room was no longer being maintained, and no further meals were being prepared for the East Wing. Whatever Eleanor Blackwood was doing appears to have stopped after Bennett's disappearance and Walsh's dismissal. The most likely explanation is that Walsh had discovered something about her employer's activities and had either been paid for her silence or had threatened exposure. This brings us to the winter of 1917-1918, when Eleanor Blackwood's public life underwent a significant change. She began to withdraw from society, canceling her annual charity ball and declining most invitations. By spring, rumors circulated that she was suffering from an unspecified illness. She made her last public appearance in May 1918 at a Liberty Bond drive, where multiple attendees commented on her pallor and thin appearance. Edith Wharton, the novelist who moved in the same social circles as Eleanor, noted in a letter to a friend, "Poor E.B. was at the Astors last night, looking like a ghost of herself. Something has gone out of her. That spark of calculation that always animated her eyes has been replaced by something I can only describe as dread. One wonders what she has seen, or perhaps what she has done." By June, Eleanor had withdrawn completely from public life. Visitors to the mansion were told she was too ill to receive them. Dr. Edwin Morris, who had taken over much of Dr. Harrington's practice, became a regular visitor to the house, sometimes staying for hours. On August 3, 1918, the New York Times reported that Eleanor Blackwood had died of complications arising from influenza, though the 1918 influenza pandemic had barely begun to affect New York at that time. Her body was not laid out for viewing, as was customary, but rather was quickly interred in the family mausoleum at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. The funeral was private, with only a handful of distant relatives and business associates in attendance. Eleanor's will left most of her fortune to various charities, with substantial bequests to the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Public Library. The mansion was to be sold, with the proceeds also going to charity. Her personal belongings were to be destroyed, an unusual stipulation that raised few eyebrows at the time given concerns about influenza transmission. This might have been the end of the story. A wealthy, eccentric woman dies young, leaving her fortune to good causes. But what happened next suggests something far more disturbing. In September 1918, just weeks after Eleanor's funeral, a woman named Victoria Caldwell purchased a brownstone in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. According to the real estate records, Ms. Caldwell was a widow who had recently relocated from Chicago after her husband's death in the war. She was described as being in her early 30s, well-spoken, and independently wealthy. The name Victoria Caldwell should sound familiar. It was the same alias Eleanor had used during her trip to Boston just before Grace Bennett's disappearance. And now someone using that name had established residence in Boston, the very city from which Bennett had vanished. Victoria Caldwell quickly established herself in Boston society as a patron of the arts and a generous donor to war relief efforts. Photographs from Boston social events show a slim woman with her dark hair styled in a fashionable bob, often wearing veils or large hats that partially obscured her face. Records from the Atlantic Bank of Boston indicate that Victoria Caldwell's accounts were funded through transfers from a New York bank that had managed some of the Blackwood investments. The transfers were authorized just days before Eleanor's reported death, suggesting a level of planning that is difficult to reconcile with a sudden illness. The similarities between Victoria Caldwell and Eleanor Blackwood might have gone unnoticed had it not been for a chance encounter in 1920. Evelyn Parker, who had been a regular guest at Eleanor's New York gatherings, was visiting Boston when she attended a concert fundraiser for veterans. There she was introduced to Victoria Caldwell and was struck by what she later described in a letter to her sister as the most unsettling sense of familiarity. "I could swear I was speaking to Eleanor Blackwood," Parker wrote. The voice was different, higher, with a slight Western accent, but the eyes were identical. She seemed to recognize me as well and became quite flustered, excusing herself almost immediately. When I mentioned to our hostess that Ms. Caldwell reminded me of an old friend from New York, she told me that Victoria had never lived in New York and, in fact, had spoken disparagingly of the city on several occasions. Parker's letter continues, "I am almost certainly imagining things. Eleanor has been dead for nearly 2 years, and grief sometimes plays tricks on one's memory. And yet, I cannot shake the feeling that Victoria Caldwell is wearing Eleanor's eyes in a slightly different face." Parker never pursued this unsettling coincidence, and Victoria Caldwell remained an active figure in Boston society until 1924, when she announced she was traveling to Europe for an extended period. She never returned, and her Boston property was eventually sold for non-payment of taxes. Was Victoria Caldwell actually Eleanor Blackwood? The evidence is circumstantial, but compelling. The timing of Caldwell's appearance so soon after Eleanor's death, the physical similarities noted by Evelyn Parker, and the substantial financial resources Caldwell possessed without any clear source, all suggest they may have been the same person. If that's true, then who was buried in Eleanor Blackwood's place in the family mausoleum at Greenwood Cemetery? No exhumation was ever performed, so we cannot know for certain. But one possibility is Harriet Walsh, Eleanor's personal maid who was dismissed in November 1917 and whose subsequent whereabouts were never established. Walsh was approximately the same age and build as Eleanor, and as a personal maid would have had access to Eleanor's private quarters and possessions. If Eleanor had decided to abandon her identity, perhaps due to fear of discovery regarding the disappearances, Walsh might have known too much to be allowed to simply leave with a severance payment. This theory is supported by the fact that none of Walsh's family or previous acquaintances reported having contact with her after her dismissal from the Blackwood household. The severance payment noted in the household accounts might have been a cover for a different kind of transaction entirely. The 1963 discovery in the Blackwood mansion adds further weight to this possibility. Among the items found was a small notebook containing what appeared to be practice signatures in Harriet Walsh's handwriting, not of her own name, but of Eleanor Blackwood. Why would a lady's maid be practicing her employer's signature unless instructed to do so? Even more compelling is a partially burned letter found among the hidden documents. Only fragments remain legible, but what can be read is deeply troubling. It appears to be from Walsh to an unidentified recipient. Cannot in good conscience continue as I have. The things I have witnessed in this house defy explanation. Miss B. is not what she appears, and I fear what might happen if... The rest of the letter is destroyed, but its existence suggests that Walsh had indeed discovered something disturbing about her employer, something that might have led to her dismissal, or worse. If Eleanor did fake her death and assume a new identity as Victoria Caldwell, it suggests a level of planning and calculation that is truly disturbing. It would mean that from at least 1911, when the disappearances began, she was preparing for the possibility of needing to escape her own life. But what of the missing women? If they weren't held captive in the mansion, what happened to them? The most troubling theory is that they served as practice for Eleanor's ultimate deception. Each disappearance allowed her to perfect her techniques of identity assumption, how to select appropriate targets, how to lure them away from their lives, how to adopt their mannerisms and backgrounds convincingly. The annotations on Grace Bennett's newspaper clippings, unsuitable temperament and too much family inquiry, suggest that Eleanor was evaluating these women as potential identity donors. Bennett may have been unsuitable because her personality was too difficult to mimic convincingly, or because her disappearance generated too much attention from her family and the authorities. This brings us to perhaps the most chilling possibility, that Eleanor Blackwood's ultimate goal was not just to steal these women's identities temporarily, but to find someone suitable to become permanently, someone whose life she could step into completely, leaving her own troubled existence behind. Did she find that person? The historical record provides no clear answers. Victoria Caldwell vanished from Boston in 1924, ostensibly to travel to Europe. After that, the trail goes cold. If she was indeed Eleanor Blackwood, she may have continued this process of identity, shifting throughout her life, moving from one persona to another whenever circumstances required it. However, there is one tantalizing lead that emerged decades later. In 1947, a woman named Elizabeth Barrett established a small but exclusive art gallery in San Francisco. Barrett claimed to be a widow from the East Coast who had spent many years in Europe before settling in California. Photographs from gallery openings show a woman in her 60s with silver-white hair and an erect posture, often wearing distinctive pearl earrings that bear a striking resemblance to those seen in one of Eleanor Blackwood's few surviving portraits. Barrett's gallery specialized in acquiring and selling European art, particularly works that had been displaced during the war. She was known for her remarkable eye for authenticity and her extensive knowledge of provenance, skills that would have been valuable to someone creating new identities for themselves. In 1952, Barrett hosted a showing of works by a relatively unknown Italian painter. Among the attendees was Richard Astor, the son of Margaret Astor, who had corresponded with Eleanor Blackwood decades earlier. According to a Society column in the San Francisco Chronicle, Astor was overheard remarking to his wife that Barrett reminded him of someone his mother had known in New York before the war. Barrett closed her gallery abruptly in 1953 and reportedly moved to Mexico for health reasons. No further trace of her has ever been found. Was Elizabeth Barrett yet another incarnation of Eleanor Blackwood? The timing would fit. She would have been in her mid-60s by then, and the shift from Boston to Europe to San Francisco would have provided ample opportunity to refine and reimagine her identity multiple times. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the potential fate of the missing women, but the insight it gives us into a mind capable of such calculated deception. Eleanor Blackwood, if she was indeed the architect of these disappearances and identity thefts, displayed a level of patience, planning, and emotional detachment that is rarely seen even in the most notorious cases of the era. The discovery in 1963 might have led to a more thorough investigation had it not coincided with a much more pressing case that demanded the resources of the New York Police Department. Within days of the construction workers' discovery, the files were transferred to federal authorities, and the Blackwood Mansion renovation continued under close supervision. By 1965, the mansion had been converted into luxury apartments, with the east wing completely reconfigured to eliminate the separate entrance and any trace of Eleanor's hidden workshop. The documents and items found behind the false wall were cataloged and stored in government archives, where they remained largely forgotten until a partial declassification in 1982 brought some of the material to light. Even then, the case received little attention. The events were too distant, the evidence too circumstantial, and the principal figures long dead, or at least presumed to be. Without bodies, without confessions, without any conclusive proof, the mystery of Eleanor Blackwood and the missing women remained little more than a historical footnote. But for those who study the case, certain questions remain troubling. If Eleanor did fake her death and become Victoria Caldwell, who in turn disappeared to Europe, did she assume yet another identity there? And if so, how many times did she repeat this process throughout her life? The pattern that emerges from the available evidence suggests a woman of extraordinary intelligence and calculation, capable of planning years ahead. Each identity she may have assumed appears to have been carefully researched and selected, each transition meticulously arranged. Victoria Caldwell, for instance, claimed to be from Chicago, a city far enough from New York to make verification difficult, but not so exotic as to invite undue curiosity. She presented herself as a war widow at a time when many women had lost husbands, making her story both sympathetic and common enough to discourage too many questions. Elizabeth Barrett, if she was indeed another incarnation, positioned herself as an art expert who had spent the war years in Europe, a background that would be nearly impossible to verify in the aftermath of the Second World War, when records throughout Europe had been destroyed and displaced. Persons were still being identified. Each identity also maintained certain consistencies with Eleanor's known preferences: an interest in the arts, a position on the periphery of high society, and a carefully cultivated air of privacy. These were not random choices, but calculated decisions that allowed her to maintain aspects of her true self while presenting a new face to the world. Given that she was only 33 at the time of her supposed death in 1918, she could theoretically have lived for several more decades, shifting identities whenever necessary. Someone with her resources and apparent skill at deception might have continued this pattern well into the mid-20th century, which raises perhaps the most unsettling question of all. How many Eleanor Blackwoods have there been throughout history? How many wealthy, reclusive women have actually been someone else entirely, someone who studied them, mimicked them, and ultimately replaced them? And how would we ever know? In 1968, a small notice appeared in the classified section of the New York Times. It read simply, "E.B., 1885-1968. The final performance has concluded." It was published on August 3rd, exactly 50 years after Eleanor Blackwood's reported death. The notice was paid for in cash, and the person who placed it was described by the clerk as an elderly woman with remarkable posture. No one claimed responsibility for the notice, and its significance went unrecognized until years later, when researchers connecting the declassified Blackwood files noticed the coincidence of dates. Was this a final curtain call from Eleanor herself? Had she lived a full life through multiple identities, only to acknowledge her true self at the very end? A review of probate records from San Francisco reveals that an Elizabeth Barrett died in Mexico City in June 1968. Her estate, which consisted primarily of art and investments, was left to various cultural institutions in San Francisco, New York, and Boston, cities where Eleanor, Victoria, and Elizabeth had all lived. The executor of the will was a Mexican lawyer who claimed never to have met Barrett in person, having conducted all business through written correspondence. We will likely never know for certain if these women were all the same person. The Blackwood mansion was demolished in 1972 to make way for a modern apartment building. Greenwood Cemetery suffered damage to several mausoleums, including the Blackwoods, during a storm in 1977, and any remains that might have answered our questions were removed and cremated as part of the restoration process. All that remains of this disturbing case are fragments, ledger entries, newspaper clippings, and the testimony of long-dead witnesses. Like pieces of a shattered mirror, they reflect only distorted glimpses of a truth we can never fully reconstruct. But perhaps that's fitting. Eleanor Blackwood, if indeed she was the architect of this elaborate deception, understood better than most how fragile identity truly is, how easily a life can be constructed, discarded, and forgotten. Her greatest accomplishment may have been disappearing so completely that we cannot be certain she ever existed at all. Yet the missing women were real. Catherine Miller had parents who mourned her. Jane Porter had students who wondered what happened to their teacher. Grace Bennett had patients who lost their nurse. Their disappearances left holes in the world that were never filled, questions that were never answered. And so the case of Eleanor Blackwood remains open in the technical sense, though there is no one left to investigate and no clear crime to prosecute. It exists now as a whisper from another time, a reminder that behind the elegant facades of even the most respected houses, darkness sometimes dwells. In 2002, during renovations to one of the luxury condominiums that now occupy the site of the Blackwood mansion, workers discovered a small metal box sealed within a wall cavity. Inside was a single photograph, a group portrait of 11 young women, all with similar dark hair and fair complexions, arranged in a semicircle. None were smiling. On the back, written in what forensic experts would later confirm, was Eleanor Blackwood's handwriting, was a single line, "My chorus of shadows." The photograph was dated July 1917, just months before Eleanor's withdrawal from society and supposed death. The faces of the women have never been positively identified, though researchers have suggested they may be the missing women whose disappearances coincided with Eleanor's movements. If so, the photograph raises more questions than it answers. Were these women held captive in the Blackwood mansion? Were they somehow coerced into participating in Eleanor's elaborate identity experiments? Or does the photograph represent something else entirely? Perhaps the many faces that Eleanor herself wore throughout her strange and secretive life. There is one final piece to this puzzle, discovered in 2018 when a collector of rare books purchased a first edition of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence at an estate sale in Mexico City. Tucked inside was a pressed flower and a handwritten note that read, "We wear the faces that serve us best. Some of us wear many. I have worn 11. Each one was chosen with care, each one served its purpose, and each one was discarded when its usefulness ended. Only I remain behind every mask, watching the world believe what it sees rather than what is. This is my true legacy, not railroads or mansions, but the art of becoming someone else entirely while never ceasing to be myself." E.B. The note has never been authenticated, and skeptics suggest it may be a clever forgery created to capitalize on the enduring mystery of Eleanor Blackwood. But if genuine, it offers a chilling insight into the mind of a woman who may have perfected the art of identity theft to a degree rarely seen before or since. The next time you pass an impressive mansion with drawn curtains or meet the gaze of a wealthy woman whose eyes seem to evaluate rather than see, perhaps you'll remember the story of the Blackwood heiress and wonder just for a moment who might really be looking back at you. In the end, the true horror of Eleanor Blackwood's story lies not in what we know, but in what we don't, and perhaps never will. It lies in the spaces between the facts, in the shadows cast by unanswered questions, and in the possibility that someone could remove themselves so completely from their own life only to step seamlessly into another. It lies in the realization that identity itself, that thing we consider most fundamental to who we are, can be crafted, manipulated, and transferred like any other possession. And it lies in the unsettling awareness that we may pass such people on the street every day, never knowing that the face they present to the world is not their own, but one they have carefully selected from a wardrobe of stolen lives. The case files on Eleanor Blackwood remain open, technically unsolved. The missing women have never been found. The truth about what happened in that mansion on Fifth Avenue has never been fully revealed, and perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of this entire case. Not that it ended, but that it may have continued undetected for decades afterward. Photographs from Eleanor Blackwood's time show a New York that was rapidly changing. Automobiles replacing carriages, skyscrapers rising alongside brownstones, electric lights gradually replacing gas lamps. It was a period of transformation when the old social order was beginning to give way to something new. Perhaps Eleanor sensed this change and realized that in a world increasingly connected by technology and communication, maintaining a false identity would become more difficult. Perhaps this motivated her elaborate scheme to disappear and re-emerge elsewhere. The FBI files on the Blackwood case, partially declassified in 1982, contain a curious memo dated October 1963, just weeks after the discovery in the mansion. It reads, "Investigation of subject EB to be suspended indefinitely. All materials to be classified under national security protocols. No further action authorized at this time." The memo is signed by a deputy director whose name has been redacted. Why would a case involving disappearances from the 1910s be classified as a matter of national security in 1963? Some researchers have suggested that Eleanor Blackwood's techniques for assuming new identities may have been of particular interest to government agencies during the Cold War, when the creation of cover identities for operatives was a critical intelligence function. Others have proposed a more disturbing possibility, that Eleanor Blackwood may not have been acting alone, but might have been part of a larger network of identity manipulators, individuals who had perfected the art of becoming someone else entirely. The methodology evident in Eleanor's hidden workshop, the careful selection of targets, the meticulous documentation, the practice signatures, suggests a systematic approach that may have been taught rather than invented. If such a network existed, it would explain the government's interest in suppressing information about the case. It might also explain why so many of the documents related to the investigation remain classified even today. In 1965, 2 years after the discovery in the Blackwood mansion, a similar hidden room was reportedly found during renovations to a house in Baltimore, owned by a woman named Margaret Sinclair, who had died the previous year at the age of 81. According to unverified accounts, the room contained wigs, identity documents, and newspaper clippings similar to those found in New York. Before any investigation could proceed, however, federal agents reportedly seized all materials from the Baltimore house, and the matter was never publicly addressed. Was Margaret Sinclair connected to Eleanor Blackwood? Were they part of the same network? Or is this simply another urban legend that has attached itself to the mysterious heiress, expanding her story beyond the boundaries of what can be verified? What we do know with certainty is that between 1911 and 1917, 11 young women disappeared from locations throughout the Northeast. None were ever found. All had certain physical characteristics in common. All vanished after being offered employment or opportunity by someone they had never met before. And in each case, Eleanor Blackwood can be placed in the vicinity, around the time of the disappearance. We also know that the handwriting identified as Catherine Miller's continues in Eleanor's ledgers for 8 months after Miller's disappearance, then stops abruptly. The handwriting identified as belonging to Harriet Walsh appears regularly in the household accounts until November 1917, then never again. And Eleanor Blackwood herself supposedly died in August 1918, only to have someone remarkably similar appear in Boston weeks later under the name Victoria Caldwell. The patterns are too consistent to be coincidental, yet too incomplete to form a definitive conclusion. Like a mosaic with critical pieces missing, we can see the outlines of a picture without ever being able to discern its full form. In 1969, a year after the mysterious obituary for E. Bies appeared in the New York Times, a small private gallery in Mexico City held an exhibition of portrait photography. Among the works displayed was a series of 11 photographs, all of the same woman, but with subtle variations in appearance, different hairstyles, different makeup, different expressions. According to the exhibition catalog, the series was titled Iterations of Self, and was credited to a photographer identified only as E. A visitor to the exhibition, an American art critic, noted in his review that the subject of the photographs had a peculiar quality of both presence and absence, as if she is simultaneously revealing and concealing herself. One has the unsettling sense that these are not merely variations on a theme, but entirely different people wearing the same face, or perhaps the same person wearing different souls. The photographs were purchased by an anonymous collector and have not been publicly displayed since. The gallery closed shortly after the exhibition, and the photographer E. never showed work there again. Was this a final artistic statement from Eleanor Blackwood, a visual representation of her life's work in identity manipulation, or simply a coincidence, another thread woven into the tapestry of myth that has grown around her story over the decades? In the absence of definitive answers, the case of Eleanor Blackwood and her chorus of shadows remains one of the most disturbing examples of identity theft in American history, not because of what was stolen, but because of what may have been left behind. 11 lives interrupted, 11 families left without closure, and the possibility that the architect of these disappearances may have continued her work undetected for decades afterward. The psychological profile of Eleanor Blackwood, compiled by FBI analysts in the 1960s, based on the materials found in the mansion, suggests an individual with an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization and emotional detachment. She appears to have viewed identity not as something intrinsic, but as a construct to be assembled and disassembled at will, a costume to be worn rather than a self to be expressed. This perspective may have roots in Eleanor's unusual childhood. Thomas Blackwood was known to be controlling and emotionally distant, while Caroline was frequently described as fragile and dependent. Growing up in such an environment, young Eleanor may have learned early that survival depended on becoming whatever her parents needed her to be, a chameleon adapting to the emotional climate around her. This adaptive strategy, initially developed as a defense mechanism, may have evolved into something more calculated as Eleanor matured. Rather than simply responding to others' expectations, she began to proactively create and project identities that served her specific purposes. The ledgers found in the mansion suggest that Eleanor maintained detailed records not only of financial transactions, but of behavioral observations. Entries include notes such as "response to grief story effective," generated immediate sympathy and deflected questions about background, and "Boston accent requires further refinement," our pronunciation inconsistent. These are not the notes of someone playing a role temporarily, but of someone methodically constructing and testing complete identities. The level of detail and analysis indicates a person who viewed human interaction as a series of performances to be studied, refined, and perfected. But what was the ultimate goal? If Eleanor was indeed assuming the identities of the missing women for short periods, then fabricating her own death to become Victoria Caldwell permanently, what was she seeking? Freedom from her own identity? The experience of living multiple lives? Or something else entirely? Some insights may be found in a partial diary recovered from the hidden room, written in what is believed to be Eleanor's hand. One entry reads, "To be fixed in a single identity is the true death. To be known completely is to be trapped completely. Only by becoming many can I truly be free." Another, dated just weeks before her supposed death, states, "The final transformation approaches. Soon I will shed EB completely and step into a new life of my own design." All that has come before has been preparation, learning the methods, testing the boundaries, perfecting the transitions. Now I am ready to disappear absolutely. These writings suggest someone who viewed traditional identity as a constraint rather than a foundation, someone who sought liberation through multiplicity rather than authenticity. In an era when women's lives were still largely defined and confined by social expectations, perhaps Eleanor's elaborate deceptions were, in her mind, a form of rebellion, a way of escaping not just her own specific identity, but the very concept of fixed identity itself. Yet we cannot overlook the human cost of this philosophical experiment. Whatever Eleanor's motivations, her actions appear to have involved the disappearance of 11 young women whose lives and potentials were cut short. Even if they were not physically harmed, and we have no evidence either way, they were removed from their families, friends, and communities, erased, so that Eleanor could practice becoming someone else. The elaborate nature of subjects' activities, the apparent lack of emotional connection to victims, and the methodical documentation all suggest an individual capable of compartmentalizing actions in a manner that would allow for the maintenance of a public persona entirely disconnected from private behaviors. In other words, Eleanor Blackwood appears to have been that most disturbing of individuals, someone capable of presenting a completely normal, even admirable, external self, while concealing actions that most would consider monstrous. The FBI profile concludes, subject demonstrates characteristics consistent with what would now be classified as severe antisocial personality disorder with elements of narcissistic personality disorder. Her position in society, her wealth, and her careful cultivation of a respectable public image created a perfect screen behind which she could pursue her true interests undetected. This brings us to perhaps the most troubling aspect of this case. If Eleanor Blackwood could live a double life so successfully, if she could maintain her position in New York high society while simultaneously engineering the disappearances of 11 women, how many others like her might exist, both then and now? How many people move through the world wearing carefully constructed personas that bear little resemblance to their true selves? How many have learned, like Eleanor, that the right appearance, the right mannerisms, and the right story can open almost any door? And how would we ever know them for what they truly are? In 1972, a psychology professor at Columbia University wrote a paper titled "The Blackwood Paradigm: Identity as Performance in High-Functioning Sociopaths." Though never published in a mainstream journal due to the classified nature of much of the case material, the paper circulated among law enforcement and intelligence agencies as a framework for understanding individuals who treat identity as a tactical tool rather than an intrinsic quality. The paper proposed that such individuals often select high-status, low-scrutiny social positions. Wealthy widows, reclusive artists, eccentric academics, roles that afford both respect and privacy. They typically establish patterns of occasional withdrawal or travel to explain periodic absences. They maintain meticulous records but share minimal personal history, and they often demonstrate an unusual interest in the details of others' lives while revealing little about their own. These characteristics, the paper suggested, should be considered warning signs when encountered in combination, not of criminal intent necessarily, but of a fundamental disconnection between presented self and actual self. The paper concluded with a sobering observation. The most perfect practitioners of identity as tactical performance will never be identified as such. By definition, those who are most successful at presenting false selves are those least likely to be detected. We can study only the failures and the partial successes, those who left evidence or made mistakes. The true masters remain invisible, their performances so flawless that we accept them without question as the people they claim to be. Eleanor Blackwood, for all her apparent skill at deception, made enough mistakes to leave a trail: the hidden room, the collected newspaper clippings, the detailed ledgers. Had she simply destroyed these materials before her disappearance, her connection to the missing women might never have been discovered. Her transformation into Victoria Caldwell, and perhaps subsequently into Elizabeth Barrett, might have remained perfect and undetected. What other Eleanor Blackwoods have lived among us, more careful or more thorough in covering their tracks? What perfect performances have we witnessed and accepted without question? These are questions without answers, shadows without substance, possibilities that can be neither proven nor disproven. And yet the case of Eleanor Blackwood serves as a reminder that identity, that thing we consider most fundamental to who we are, can be more fluid, more malleable, and more easily manipulated than we might wish to believe. In 2018, a small exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York included one of the few surviving photographs of Eleanor Blackwood, taken at a charity event in 1916. In it, she stands slightly apart from a group of socialites, her face partially turned away from the camera. She is elegantly dressed in the fashion of the period, her posture perfect, her expression composed. Nothing about her appearance suggests anything other than what she was presumed to be: a wealthy, refined heiress fulfilling her social obligations. Yet, knowing what we now suspect about Eleanor Blackwood, the photograph takes on a different quality. One notices the calculated distance she maintains from the others in the frame, the way her gaze seems directed not at any person, but at some point in the middle distance, observing everything while engaging with nothing. One sees not a woman participating in society, but an actress playing a role, and playing it perfectly. A visitor to the exhibit reportedly stood looking at this photograph for nearly an hour. When finally approached by a museum staff member, the visitor, described as an elderly woman with remarkably good posture, smiled and said, "She had the right idea, you know. We're all just wearing faces. Some of us are simply more honest about it being a performance." The woman left before the staff member could respond. Her comment was noted in the daily log but otherwise forgotten until researchers investigating the Blackwood case came across it years later. One more ambiguous footnote in a story composed almost entirely of unanswered questions and unresolved possibilities. The next time you look in the mirror, perhaps you'll wonder just for a moment how many faces you wear throughout your life, how many versions of yourself you present to different people in different contexts. And perhaps you'll consider how thin the line truly is between adapting to social situations and constructing entire false identities. Eleanor Blackwood crossed that line definitively. She stepped from adaptation into fabrication, from social flexibility into something much darker. In doing so, she left behind a legacy of disappearances, deceptions, and disturbing questions about the nature of identity itself. The case of the Blackwood heiress remains officially unsolved. The 11 women who disappeared between 1911 and 1917 remain missing, and Eleanor herself, if indeed she did fake her death and assume new identities, has long since vanished into history, leaving behind only fragments and echoes, shadows and whispers, and the lingering uncertainty about who she really was beneath all her carefully constructed facades. Perhaps that, in the end, is the true horror of her story, not what she may have done to others, but what she willingly did to herself. In her determination to be many people, she may have ultimately become no one at all.